Ford Motor Company looked like America's cleanest success. Cheap cars, roaring lines, paychecks on time. Inside Dearborn, it ran like a family kingdom, and Henry Ford treated profits like ammunition. When investors demanded their cut, Henry refused, and the whispers started: who was loyal, who was next, and what Henry would do to keep control before the next payroll. Hello, I'm William. Let's get into it. If you wanted to understand Henry Ford, you didn't start with cars. You started with control. Ford Motor Company wasn't built like an old money corporation with committees and gentle compromises. It was built like a workshop that accidentally became an empire. The Model T turned into a machine for converting steel, rubber, and hours into cash. And Henry Ford didn't see that cash as shareholder value. He saw it as fuel for the next expansion. Detroit bankers and minority investors saw something else. They saw a company printing profits so fast it looked irresponsible not to take dividends. In the Gilded Age mindset, dividends weren't greed. They were the point. A return proved the system was legitimate. Henry didn't care. He built plants that felt like industrial cities. At Highland Park, the line didn't just speed up production. It changed the meaning of time inside a factory. Cars moved forward, whether you were ready or not. The pace became law. If one station slowed, the whole system screamed. That was Henry's preferred world. A world where the machine decides, not a boardroom. He paired that with a public story that made him dangerous to argue with. He cut prices and called it serving the public. He talked like he was liberating the working man while building a company that could crush suppliers on terms. When he introduced higher wages, it sounded like generosity. Inside the company, it also sounded like leverage. A man with a better paycheck is a man who's easier to keep loyal. Now add the people around him. There were managers who could actually run the place, the kind of men who knew the books and the bottlenecks. There were minority shareholders who weren't employees and didn't care about the romance of production. And there were rivals who were still inside the house. The Dodge brothers were the most awkward example. They supplied parts early, made serious money off the relationship, and owned a stake in Ford. They watched Henry turn the company into a cash engine, and they understood something sharp. Ford's profits could bankroll Ford's expansion forever, which meant the minority owners might never get paid unless they forced the issue. Henry saw that as betrayal, not business conflict. Betrayal. He treated Ford like a personal mission, and anyone demanding dividends started to look like someone trying to hijack the mission. That's when the tone in Dearborn shifts from fast-growing company to court-in-waiting. The first cracks show up in small moments. A meeting where an executive uses the word dividend too casually, and the room goes quiet. A finance man suggesting the company should behave like a normal corporation, and Henry staring at him like he just swore in church. Workers hearing that the owners are fighting, and suddenly every rumor in the plant gets sharper. And rumors did spread. Later accounts and old workplace talk claimed you could feel loyalty being measured. Who spoke too freely? Who stayed late? Who got promoted fast? Nothing you could easily prove, but enough to make people lower their voices when Henry's name came up. Then Henry makes the decision that turns a disagreement into a war. He starts talking about building bigger, not a modest expansion, a total industrial system, more capacity, more integration, more everything. He frames it as progress and independence. The subtext is simple. If I keep reinvesting, "You can't force me to act like a normal company." That's the moment Ford stops being an automaker and becomes a battlefield. Because now, the shareholders aren't arguing about a number. They're arguing about whether Henry Ford is allowed to run a public corporation like a private kingdom. And once that question is asked out loud, it doesn't stay in the boardroom. It spreads into the factory, into the supplier network, and into the Ford family itself, starting with the one person Henry trusts enough to put in front of the cameras: his son, Edsel. The first thing that split Ford wasn't a crash or a strike. It was a word spoken in a quiet room: dividend. In a normal company, that word is routine. At Ford, it sounded like a challenge. Henry Ford had built the Model T into a production storm, and the storm was throwing off cash. He kept cutting the car's price, kept expanding output, and kept telling the public he was doing it for the people. Then he did the move that made investors feel trapped. In 1914, he announced the famous $5 day. The country heard generosity. Inside the company, it also sounded like leverage. Better wages meant more loyalty. More loyalty meant fewer questions. By 1915, the company's profits were so large that minority owners expected the same thing they'd been getting: big special dividends. Records show Ford had built a surplus that kept growing, money sitting there like a pile of ammunition. And Henry started refusing to hand it over. This is where the system pushes back, because Ford wasn't only Henry. It was managers, accountants, plant superintendents, and investors who'd put real money in early and now wanted rules. One of the key men in the middle was James Couzens, Ford's hard-edged business manager. Couzens understood Henry's instincts, but he also understood balance sheets and consequences. When Couzens talked about stability, Henry heard control. When shareholders talked about rights, Henry heard a takeover. Then the conflict got a face. John and Horace Dodge weren't just passive investors. They owned a big slice of Ford, around 10%, and they weren't shy about their own ambitions. They had supplied parts earlier. They knew the factory math, and they were building their own car company on the side. That detail mattered because it turned dividends into a weapon. If Ford paid out big cash, the Dodges could use it to finance a rival. People inside Dearborn noticed Henry's mood shift when the Dodge name came up. Later accounts claimed he started talking about them less like shareholders and more like enemies, living inside his walls. That's the moment the company stops feeling like an enterprise and starts feeling like a family kingdom under siege. Henry's public message stayed calm. He said he wanted to reinvest for expansion. He said he wanted to keep lowering prices. He framed it as a mission, almost moral. But the private effect was brutal. Minority owners realized they could be trapped in a company that would never pay them again, while Henry used their capital to build an even bigger empire. Then Henry made the announcement that turned irritation into open war. He pushed a massive expansion plan centered on River Rouge, a monster complex meant to turn raw materials into finished cars in one integrated system. It wasn't just a plant. It was a statement. I am not slowing down for anyone. At the same time, he signaled the end of the dividend era. No more big specials. The money stays in the machine. That's when the whispers started getting sharper. People later claimed Dearborn had an atmosphere where loyalty was constantly being measured. Who was meeting with which lawyer? Who was speaking too freely in offices? Who was suddenly being iced out of decisions? Nothing you can stamp as a fact in one clean document, but enough that employees learned to choose their words. Henry didn't help himself. He openly talked as if shareholders were a problem to manage, not partners to satisfy. To the minority owners, it sounded like a confession. He didn't believe the company belonged to them in any meaningful way. And Henry began pushing Edsel forward more visibly, not as a real counterweight yet, but as the polite face who could sit with executives, shake hands, and make the empire look civilized. It was a classic family move. The father stays absolute. The son absorbs the heat. By late 1916, the Dodge brothers stopped hoping and started attacking. They filed suit. That was the moment Ford became a war room. Not in public, in private. Lawyers, memos, strategy sessions, and a question that hung over everything like smoke. If a court can force Henry Ford to act like a normal corporation, what happens to a kingdom built on one man refusing to be normal? The lawsuit hit Ford like an insult, delivered in front of the whole room. The Dodge brothers didn't file it as a polite complaint. They filed it as a demand for control over what profits mean. Pay dividends. Stop treating the company like a private cash tank. Act like a corporation. Henry Ford heard only one message. You're trying to put a leash on me. So he responded the way he always responded to pressure. He doubled down on the story that made him untouchable. He wasn't hoarding money, he said. He was building. He was lowering prices. He was expanding employment. He framed it as a mission, which is a smart move in a family kingdom. If you can make your decisions sound moral, anyone who opposes you sounds greedy. In the offices, the mood changed fast. Lawyers appeared. Meetings ran late. Names were lowered to whispers. People who had been confident around Henry suddenly started watching his face before speaking. Later, workplace talk claimed Dearborn felt like it had two clocks. The factory clock kept the line moving. The office clock kept counting down to court. The courtroom itself became a second factory floor. Not with noise and steel, but with pressure and traps. The Dodge's lawyers wanted to prove a simple idea, that Ford's profits didn't belong to Henry's personal vision. They belonged to the shareholders. That meant Henry's public mission could be used against him. If he admitted he was refusing dividends on principle, it made their case cleaner. Henry didn't help himself. He couldn't resist speaking like the owner, not like a hired leader. He talked about what he wanted the company to do, and why. He made it sound like the board existed to approve his plan, not to govern him. Inside Ford, managers started choosing sides without saying it out loud. James Cozzens was one of the key men caught in the middle. He understood Henry's instincts and had helped build the machine, but he also understood that a corporation at Ford's size can't run on instinct alone. When Henry treated the lawsuit like a personal attack, Cozzens saw the risk. Not just legal risk, operational risk. A distracted empire makes mistakes. And then Henry turned the legal fight into a financial fight. His thinking was brutal and simple. If the minority owners want cash, make them wait until waiting hurts. Keep the surplus locked inside expansion. Keep the public cheering price cuts. Make the shareholders look like the only people standing in the way of cheap cars for everyone. This is where the dirty part of the war becomes visible without anyone throwing a punch. Ford could squeeze suppliers by volume. Ford could shift pricing and force rivals to respond. Ford could make the market itself feel unstable. And every time the market shook, minority owners got more nervous about their investment being trapped. If you can't force a dividend and you can't easily sell your shares, you're a hostage to the king's mood. Rumors from the period and later accounts described a hardening atmosphere around Henry's inner circle. The claim was not that people were openly threatened in meetings. The claim was that careers could suddenly freeze. Access could disappear. Calls wouldn't get returned. Men who questioned strategy found themselves politely pushed aside. Nothing you could stamp with a single signature. Enough to make people compliant. Edsel felt it too, because he was the one Henry kept pushing into the public-facing role. Edsel could sit with executives and talk like a modern president. He could reassure bankers and civic leaders. He could make Ford look like a normal company. But inside the family, normal wasn't the point. Control was. So while the lawsuit crawled forward, the company kept expanding like a statement. More capacity, more integration, more proof that Henry wasn't going to be boxed in by a courtroom. The more the system grew, the more terrifying the question became for the minority owners. What happens if the court sides with Henry's philosophy? Because if it does, Ford becomes the template for a new kind of corporate monarchy. One man reinvesting forever, refusing payouts forever, and daring anyone to stop him. And if the court sides against him, Henry has only one way to win. Not by arguing, by buying everyone out and ending the debate permanently. When the case finally landed in front of a judge, Henry Ford didn't act like a defendant. He acted like a man being audited by strangers. He kept talking about the company as if it were his tool, built for his purpose. The minority owners kept repeating the same point. This is not a private shop anymore. The ruling forced an answer. Henry hated. A big special dividend was ordered, money pulled out of the surplus and pushed toward shareholders. In the room around Henry, people read that as a loss. Henry read it as a warning. If courts can reach into Ford's cash, courts can reach into Ford's steering wheel. That's when the war shifted from win the case to end the problem. People close to Ford later said Henry talked about escape routes. One rumor that stuck was that he'd threatened to start a new company, pull attention and business away, and make the existing shares feel weaker. The idea wasn't subtle. If you can't control the board, you can make the board irrelevant by building a new table. At the same time, his inner office tightened. His longtime aide, E.G. Leibold, became a gatekeeper, the man who decided who got through and when. Workers and clerks whispered about lists, about notes taken after meetings, about who suddenly stopped getting invited. You couldn't prove most of it from the outside, but you could feel the temperature drop inside the building. Then Henry did the move that made every banker in Detroit sit up. He decided he would buy them out. All of them. The Dodges, the minor investors, the men who kept saying corporate order. He'd turn a public corporation into a private kingdom again, even if it cost a fortune. This is where the father versus system story gets sharp, because Henry hated bankers almost as much as he hated being told what to do. But buying out shareholders at Ford's scale meant one thing: cash, a mountain of it. And even Henry Ford couldn't pull that much out of a desk drawer. So the company that was built on production discipline turned into a financial emergency drill. Negotiations ran late. Numbers got rewritten. Men who usually moved slowly started moving fast, because everyone understood what happens if this deal collapses. Henry stays trapped with shareholders who hate him, or Henry breaks the company trying to free himself. In 1919, the buyout happened. The Dodges took their money and walked, and it wasn't small money. Cousins took his money and walked too. a man who helped build the machine, now leaving it behind. Ford's empire didn't just pay them, it cut them out of the bloodstream. From the outside, it looked like Henry won. He had control again. No minority voices, no dividend demands, no courtroom leverage inside his walls. But the win came with a cost you don't see on the balance sheet. When you purge the system, you also purge the brakes. The company now depended even more on Henry's mood, Henry's instincts, and Henry's private circle. And the more the empire grew, the more dangerous that became. Because the next enemy wouldn't be a shareholder with a lawsuit. It would be time, age, and the one person Henry could never fully fire: his own son, Edsel. After the buyout, Edsel Ford became president on paper. Henry Ford became something more dangerous than a president. He was the owner again, the final voice, the man everyone still feared disappointing. In public, Edsel looked like the future. He dressed like a modern executive. He spoke calmly. He could sit with bankers, city leaders, and suppliers without turning every conversation into a personal crusade. Inside Dearborn, the future kept hitting a wall called Henry. Edsel wanted the company to evolve. New models, better styling, a cleaner organization that didn't depend on one man's mood. Henry kept treating the company like a moral project that only he understood. When Edsel talked about market shifts, Henry heard excuses. When Edsel talked about competitors, Henry heard cowardice. The first big family fight wasn't sentimental. It was product. By the mid-1920s, the Model T was aging. Competitors were offering more choices, more comfort, more updates. Edsel and the managers around him pushed for change. Henry resisted because the Model T wasn't just a car. It was proof his way worked. So meetings turned into rituals. Edsel would present numbers. Managers would talk about dealer pressure. Someone would mention Chevrolet gaining ground. Henry would sit there, quiet, then dismiss it with one sentence that froze the room. The kind of sentence that tells everyone the conversation is over. But the tension is not. When Ford finally shut down the Model T and retooled for the Model A, it didn't feel like a smooth transition. It felt like the kingdom forcing the king to move, and the king never forgetting who pushed. That's where the next layer of the war forms. Henry didn't just resist decisions. He built an atmosphere where decisions had consequences. Edsel could be president and still be overruled in a hallway. An executive could agree with Edsel in a meeting and then change his tone when Henry walked in. Later accounts from people around the company described the same pattern. You learn to watch which way the loyalty wind is blowing before you speak. And Henry had a tool for loyalty: his service department. Officially, it was security. In practice, it became a private enforcement system inside an industrial empire. It watched workers, watched visitors, and watched managers who started acting too independent. Stories from the period and later retellings claimed people felt monitored, not just for theft, but for attitude. Rumors spread about phone calls being listened to, about men being followed, about files kept on who said what. Some of those stories are impossible to prove cleanly now. But the point is the same. The fear was real enough that it shaped behavior. And the man who gave that fear a face was Harry Bennett. Bennett wasn't a polished executive. He was an enforcer who understood how to control a room without raising his voice. He built his power by being the one person willing to do what other managers wouldn't. He wrapped it in protecting Mr. Ford, and that phrase could justify almost anything inside the company. This is where Edsel's position becomes tragic in a very corporate way. He's not fighting his father in public. He's fighting a system of people who survive by feeding Henry what he wants to hear. Bennett becomes a gate. Liebold becomes a filter. Production men like Charles Sorensen become indispensable, which means they have to balance between father and son to keep the machine running. Edsel tries to push modernization anyway. Better design, more disciplined management. A company that can compete in the 1930s without treating every outside voice as an enemy. But every time he moves, he has to move through Henry's shadow. And the shadow gets darker when the outside world gets rough. The Depression hits, and now Ford isn't only competing with other car makers, it's managing desperation. Wages matter more. Jobs matter more. Unions start pressing harder. And Henry's instincts return to the same setting: control. This is where the company war spills into the street. When labor organizers came to Ford, they didn't meet friendly HR managers. They met Bennett's men. The most infamous moment was the Battle of the Overpass in 1937, when union organizers trying to distribute leaflets were beaten and driven off. Edsel wasn't the one swinging fists, but it happened inside his company, under his name, while his father's system still held the levers. It made Edsel look weak and complicit at the same time. The worst combination. Inside Dearborn, the whispers sharpened again. Not just about workers being watched, about executives being tested, about who could speak to Edsel without Bennett hearing, about who could bring bad news without becoming the bad news. Edsel kept showing up. He kept signing his name. He kept trying to run a modern corporation with a private kingdom sitting on top of it. And that kind of pressure doesn't need a dramatic explosion to do damage. It just needs time. By the early 1940s, war production is looming, and Ford's internal chaos becomes a national concern. Government officials need output. The military needs engines and vehicles. The company needs coherent leadership. Edsel tries to align the business with the reality of the moment. Henry keeps resisting being managed, even by history. And in that tightening vice, the family war reaches the point where the question isn't who wins the argument. It's whether the heir can survive the kingdom long enough to inherit it. By the early 1940s, Ford's family war stopped being a private tragedy and became a national risk. America was moving toward total war production. The government wanted output, deadlines, predictability. Ford had the plants, the workers, the name. What it didn't have was a single, coherent command chain. Inside Dearborn, people still waited for Henry's mood before they acted, and that is poison in wartime. Edsel tried to be the bridge. He pushed for modernization and cooperation. He also looked exhausted because the company was fighting two wars at once, one outside and one at the dinner table. Later accounts described him as trapped between a father who wouldn't release control and an enforcement system that punished anyone who moved too freely. Then Edsel's body gave out. In May 1943, Edsel Ford died, and the company lost the one person who could soften Henry's rule without provoking it. The heir was gone, and the kingdom didn't suddenly become calm. It became unbalanced. Henry Ford stepped back in, older and less stable, still convinced that he alone understood the company's purpose. And in that vacuum, Harry Bennett's power swelled. The service department wasn't just security anymore. It felt like the real spine inside the company, the part that could say yes or no when everyone else hesitated. People who lived through that period later described an atmosphere of fear and confusion. Not always shouting, sometimes just silence. Meetings where nobody wanted to be the one to bring bad news. Decisions delayed because nobody knew which Henry would show up that day, and nobody wanted Bennett's attention for the wrong reason. This is where the family war produces its final, ugliest twist. Henry Ford had built Ford to resist the system. Now the company needed a system to survive Henry. That's why the next heir wasn't introduced with celebration. He was pulled in like emergency labor. Henry Ford II came back into a company that still had smokestacks and assembly lines, but felt dangerously personal at the top. One set of men acted like the company belonged to Henry's will. Another set understood the finances and the government pressure and could see the cliff edge. And Bennett was the problem everyone could name quietly, but couldn't confront safely. There were hard rumors around Dearborn about Bennett's reach, about who got watched, about who got boxed out, about how close he was to Henry's ear. Whether every detail was true almost didn't matter, because the fear shaped behavior like it was true. The removal had to be fast, clean, and final. The showdown, as later accounts tell it, wasn't a long debate. It was a door closing, a small group of loyal men in the room, and Henry Ford II making it clear that the kingdom was changing owners in practice, not just on paper. Bennett left, and the company's internal weather changed overnight. Not because everyone suddenly trusted each other, but because the enforcement shadow lifted. Then came the rebuild. Ford Motor Company didn't just need a new boss. It needed a new operating religion. Real budgets, real accountability. Managers who didn't survive by guessing Henry's mood. The young Henry Ford II began pulling in professional leadership and modern control systems, turning the family kingdom into a corporate machine that could actually compete in the post-war world. That's the real ending of this story. Henry Ford won the early wars against shareholders and corporate order. He bought out the system and made himself absolute. But absolute power inside a family company creates a problem money can't solve. It breaks the air. It attracts enforcers. It makes truth expensive. And eventually, it forces the next generation to build the very system the founder spent his life resisting. The last image I keep is not a courtroom. It's Dearborn at night. The plant still running, lights steady, the line moving the way Henry always wanted. But upstairs, the kingdom is quieter. The whispered fear is fading. The company is being rebuilt into something Henry never intended, a Ford without Henry's personal law. Like the video, subscribe, and comment where are you watching from. This is where we tell old money power wars without the polite version. If you watched the video to the end, did you feel sorry for Edsel?